Hi, I'm Kathy Muehlhauser with the Huron Historical Society and the Huron Public Library. Today is April 11th, 2009, and I'm interviewing Bob Jones for the Huron Oral History Project. Well, hi, Bob. Thanks for coming to talk to us today. And I was wondering if you could tell us about growing up in Huron.
I'd be glad to. It was a great town to grow up in. I don't know how you could have had a more idealistic childhood than growing up in Huron. My parents moved here in 1941, and it was a very small town then. There were about 1,200 people, and obviously a lot different than it is today. Then, as now, there was no shortage of characters in this town. We seemed to have our overload, and everybody had a nickname. Nobody escaped. I won't even start to name all of them. Another thing I remember about the town back then was it had a lot of bars. I was told it had 18 bars at that time. I don't know, I was never in them, obviously. But the idea in having that many bars was because of the extreme number of lake freighters here and the summer visitors. Huron was really a summer town. We went from 1,200 people as a normal residency to about 10,000 in the summertime. And on Saturday morning, you couldn't walk down Main Street. It was crowded. There were actually people all over the place. We had a very lively downtown with anything you wanted, and everything from the first cove out was outside of the city limits. That's where the city limits were then, and those were all summer cabins out there. They had no heat. They were just shells. They've since obviously been converted to year-round housing, and it was the same way east of town. Old Homestead was all summer homes. So we had a whole lot of people who none of us knew. Even Chaska Beach at that time, the lakefront area there, was summer homes. Extremely wealthy people from Mansfield, Ashland would have very large homes that they only used in the summertime. Sometimes they rented out in the winter, but for the most part they were empty in the winter. Another thing that I remember is unusual is the high number of grocery stores. When I was a youngster, I believe we had 6 grocery stores in town. We had Cook's Grocery, which was on the corner of Main Street and where Bruns's or D. Hartley's. That was Cook's Grocery Store. Then you come down a block and Thomas's was on the next corner. Then you got downtown, and you had Hart's, and you had Smith's, and you had Hennis's. Hennis was on the corner of Cleveland Road, or what was Homan Street then, and Main Street. And he had not only a hardware store, but a grocery store there, and he delivered all over town. Then on the other side of the street was the Kroger store. Building is obviously gone now, but that's where Dave Steinberger had his hardware store.
So would people shop for groceries, or did they call in and the shopkeepers would deliver them?
The shopkeepers delivered. You could do either, but it was primarily delivery. I can remember my mother calling Hennis Hardware or Hennis Grocery Store for her weekly grocery order, and I complained until he brought me 100 nuts for my erector set because I always lost them. You could get anything. They were very accommodating. And then there was also a store at Rye Beach. Rye Beach was almost a city unto itself out there, because so the dance hall was still there, and now I take that back. I don't remember the dance hall. The dance hall was burnt down. I remember stories about it, but the store was still there. It was very much of a summer town.
Where did you live?
I lived on Homan Street, the second house east of the Cove, what we called the first Cove back then. I don't know what they call it now. Do they still call it that?
Yeah, the Cove.
Okay, on the north side of the road, 429 Homan Street.
But is Homan now Cleveland Road?
Homan is now Cleveland. I don't know why they changed it, but it was Homan up to about the 70s, maybe, late 60s, something. Another neat thing about Huron was what I call the Huron Reporting Service. Not the paper, but you could never do anything wrong. At least your parents heard from at least 3 sources before you got home what you'd done. And somebody was waiting for you to tell you about your indiscretions. One time, Lillian McCormick was the principal at junior high, and she was quite a taskmaster. And some of us didn't like her very well. Now, she was an excellent teacher and a wonderful human being, and didn't deserve some of the things we did to her. There was one outhouse left in Huron, and that was down on south of the tracks on Center Street. There were several of us decided that that would be a good thing to put on Lillian's front porch. We carried that thing the whole length of town by hand in the middle of the night, plopped it on her front porch, and really rejoiced that we'd pull something off. We no more got to school than over the loudspeaker reads a list of names. Will you report to the office? You have an outhouse to move.
Oh my gosh.
She was sitting in there and watched every one of us. And she called our names, and we had to go carry that. But we weren't allowed to go back the way we came. We had to go down Main Street so everybody could see us.
How many were there?
There were 6 of us.
Oh my gosh.
We had fun. It was another thing I remember are the houses that came in from Cleveland on the barges. They were unloaded right down just north of the Twine House, as I remember, and put on skids and moved to their locations. I believe the one is right beside Scott's house on Ohio Street, and I think the other one is Swanbeck's on Wall Street, isn't it?
I'm not sure about that.
There were 2 of them.
Why did they bring houses in by barge from Cleveland?
Well, number 1, they were cheap, and number 2, they were falling into the lake. So all that area along Lake Road between Huron and Cleveland eroded quite badly. So somebody got the bright idea that it was, and they were very nice homes. I believe Walt Myers moved them. He was a local contractor. And his son is still around here, Lynn. He may know something about that. I remember we've had several bad train wrecks at the Main Street crossing. At one time, the scouts were called out to protect it right after the Second World War. We had to stand watch.
The Boy Scouts?
The Boy Scouts, because they couldn't find enough people to do it. And the one freight car had nylons on it. And there was a real shortage of nylon stockings after the war. And they felt that was important enough.
Why was there a shortage of nylon?
From the war. They used all the nylon in the war, and it took about 4 years to convert that to consumer production again, is my understanding. One of the things that my grandfather told me, and he was involved in, was the fight, and it was a real fight, to bring Dr. Wechter into town. This was back at the time when osteopaths were not well accepted. Dr. Reed was a local MD on Main Street. Thelma Reed was his wife and quite an artist in her own right. He died a number of years before she did. And he was a carmiginous person. He was just a cranky old guy. And my grandfather got along extremely well with him. And it was, the whole town was in an uproar over whether they should allow Dr. Wechter to come in. And he moved into the house right beside the old Ford garage on Main Street. Porter Wallace lived there in later years, had a glassed front on it. And he stayed in that office until he built his house down on Liberty Ave.
So what was their objection to Dr. Wechter?
They didn't accept osteopathic medicine. There was much the same conflict as you see today between the medical community and
chiropractors?
Chiropractors, yes. So it was the same situation. As I remember it, fishing, freighters, and farming were the town occupations. If you didn't work in one of those 3 occupations, there wasn't much to do. The only other factory that I can remember at the time was the pencil factory on the corner of Brolin Road and Cleveland Road East, right where the Dairy Queen stands in that area. It was then converted to Luster Corporation in later years.
And Luster made what?
They chrome plated for something. I think car parts, if I'm not mistaken. The pencil factory was quite active, though. It was dirty, smoky. The other industries that I can remember are the Kraut factory, just north of the bridge at the river, where the ore docks are, and the track goes to the south yard.
Right.
Just to the east of that, between the railroad track and east side, there was a sauerkraut factory there. In fact, the concrete pad that building was built on is still there. If you walk through the overgrowth there, well, you can find it. There were also 2 pickle factories. One was to the east of the bridge, or of the south of the bridge on the east side of the river. It had various incarnations. I think there's a car repair shop in there now. But that was a fairly active pickle plant. And the other one, Cliff Dio's dad had one on Ohio Street that had quite a reputation as being a very, very good canner of pickles.
It was on Ohio Street? Where?
Where the school is,
Yeah.
okay, the next house south is a large house with a
Right.
big porch. Back behind that, I think part of the building is gone, but that's where he operated. Now, Cliff Jr. is gone, but I believe his son is still in the community. Junior had 2 kids, a girl and a boy, and Cliff Jr. also followed that, but on a smaller scale. Another sort of grocery store was Frank Wechter's Marine Supply Store.
Where was that?
That was just north of the Sender's Tavern on the corner of Holman Street in Cleveland. And Frank maintained a boat, and there was one other person in town who did the same type of thing, and it was always a race to get to the freighters to see who got to service them. And they sold them anything they wanted, groceries, supplies, any kind of marine supplies that they would need. They were their errand boys when they got in port. And it was quite an active business. But at that time, the freighters were smaller. They were only about 300, 350 feet, and a lot of them had crews of 50 people. So it was hence the bars and the other institutions that catered to those people, because there were times when there would be 8 or 10 freighters, both coal and ore, backed up in the harbor waiting to either load or unload as they could get to them, especially in the days before the electric Ulets. When they still had steam Ulets, they were much slower, and it took longer to get them unloaded. Another big thing I remember is how important scouting was at that time. There was an active troop in Huron, one of the oldest troops in the state. The records were lost in 1939 due to a fire at the scouting office. But when I was involved in scouting, and for a short time before, it was a very, very active group.
Did you go to the scout camp too?
Out on Gore Orphanage Road?
No, there was one at Sages Grove.
The scouts went out to Sages Grove to camp. Sages Grove was a company location for the Electric Interurban Railway. They had that for their employees to use for recreational purposes. They would have a car stop there, they would bring their employees out. And the most I can remember about that is, and that's right about where Beechwood Cove is now, there were still platforms there for tents. It was custom back then to build a wooden platform and then set the tent up on top of the platform. And I can remember those. But we camped there often as a troop function, but I don't think it was ever really official. We just went out there and camped.
You just did, oh, okay.
Yeah. By the time I was involved, the official scout camp over at Birmingham was quite active. And there were also several folks in town who were very, very favorable to scouting. Dean Sheldon's dad was a wonderful man and really encouraged scouting in any way. And that was a private property where the public lands are now.
He owned Sheldon's Folly, which is now Sheldon's Marsh.
Right. But we camped there quite often, and we did odd jobs for him. In other words, if he had a place in the woods that needed cleaned up, we did something for him in exchange for camping there. It was a wonderful relationship. I can't think of anybody who encouraged scouting more than he did. Another one who was very helpful was the Enderly family, Lewis Enderly, out on what was then Route 299.
And is
That's now
Route
13 or Mudbrook Road. He was both of his boys had been involved in scouting, and the farm community was actively involved in scouting at that time. In the 40s, there were a lot of the farm families who participated in scouting. The Enderly family, Norm Wilcox's crew, Buddy Batch, great people. And I think that's what made scouting what it was, because we had such a wonderful reputation to go on. The scouting in Huron, for some of us, filled a real need. There weren't the other organizations. There wasn't much going on outside the home at that point. You made your own fun. This was our connection to the outside world. And we did exotic things, like went to Cook's Forest in Pennsylvania camping, which was a major adventure. And our leaders were just superb. We had three that I can remember particularly. Our Chuck Barron, who died very early.
Right.
He was in the construction business, Bay Construction.
He helped develop Beechwood.
Yes, he did. Brilliant guy. He was a professional scouter before he came to Huron in the Norwalk office, and then was the scoutmaster in Huron. And he worked with Sam Stipp, and between the two of them, they ran a wonderful program. I mean, it was just outstanding. I can't think of a better program than what they had. I don't know how you would make it. Another one that was actively involved is Eldon Rossworm. Now, Eldon was in scouting all his life. He was highly awarded.
And what was his job in Huron?
He worked for the post office. For many years, he worked on a sorting car on the railroad between here and Chicago. This was back in the day when they sorted the mail on the train cars. We had the train station in Huron. The Huron Cement Company uses it for a warehouse now. Well, I can remember as a kid, that's where they tossed the bag out and hooked the new bag. And it was great fun to get down and wait for the train to come through and see if they missed the bag, which they did occasionally. And if they did, why, that was too bad. You waited for the next day. But it was, the cars, you stood all the time, and it had many compartments on it, and you had bags in front of you, and you sorted every bag of mail that came through. That was the way. Then at the next stop, you put it off, and it went to its proper destination. Maybe it didn't go to that stop. Maybe it continued on that train. That crew would get off at a specific location. Then, after that, he got the job as postmaster in Huron, and that's when he really got actively involved in scouting. He had a son, Jim, who was very active in scouting. Had a son-in-law, Foley was his last name. And it was just a great scouting family. Eldon had other problems in his life, but scouting was a strong point, and he just really, he added a lot to a lot of youngsters in Huron. Jumping to a newer time, I'm sure you know Audrey Makowicz, which has 10 times more stories to tell than I could ever have. One of the things that she did was make a speech at the Memorial Day service out to the cemetery one year, talking about the friends of hers that didn't come back. And I was also lucky enough to hear her give the same speech. As she watched the film here from the library, there was a publicity film taken in 1939. A company came in, and I'm sure you've seen it, where they went around to the different companies, different businesses, and sold advertising, and everybody was on it. But one of the pictures, that happened to be made in 1939, one of the pictures is of the old school here in front, right here where the library stands, and it shows all the kids coming out of that school. And she would stop that film and say, he's one. Sorry.
That's okay.
That speech should be required listening for every student. I told you a little bit about the fish houses on North Main. When I was a kid, those were fish houses from one end, from where Holman Street started, or made the curve at Main Street, all the way down to the lake. And the fish boxes would be piled up along the road, higher than 2 or 3 men, and waiting for trucks to come in and pick up. Go ahead, please.
So this was after they the boats would be unloaded?
Yes.
Okay, Bob, we left off about the fish boxes. Could you explain a little bit more about those?
Yeah, the fish boxes themselves held 100 pounds of fish, and the top board on either side extended about 6 inches beyond the box proper, so that a man could get a hold of each end. But they didn't weigh 100 pounds. They would put 100 pounds of actual fish in. Then they would heap ice on top of that. So when they got done, those boxes probably weighed 150 to 175 pounds. And those would be stacked up higher than 2 or 3 men. They looked huge to me as a young boy. And each fish house would have theirs piled in front of their house waiting for a truck to come in to pick those particular fish up. And they were shipped all over the country. There were a lot of fish went to New York City at that time because carp was in demand. Mm-hmm. It's an ethnic food that's used. And so almost any kind of fish that we had, there was a market for. I can also remember perch selling for 5 cents a pound off the boat. Now, if you've priced perch in the grocery store lately, they're about $9 to $10 a pound.
Because wasn't it kind of considered a garbage fish
It was.
back then?
Nobody wanted it. Northern pike, sturgeon were the big things, or what they called northern pike. It was a kind of walleye in the same family. But everybody wanted pike, so the perch was a junk fish.
And is that why there's not too many pike in Lake Erie anymore?
It could be. There certainly are very few sturgeon.
Right.
Occasionally I hear of one being caught, but not very often.
How many fish houses were there?
Oh boy, I can't name any more. You start up at Holman Street at the corner. Bill Scott's was the first one. He was the only one to build a new fish house in my lifetime. He had a yellow cinder block building. I've got Bill Scott in another place here, but he was, in my mind, one of the most progressive men in town. He built that new fish house because he saw the fish industry going down, and he thought that retail was the answer. So he built a conventional fish house of sorts. The back of it was made for twine repair and net mending and so on, but the front part had a glass front on it, and he had fish counters up there where it was geared to retail. And he was the only one that took that route. Some of the other ones that I can remember, there were a lot of independents back at that time. Some fished for other houses. Wiegand's obviously was one of the big ones. They had, I think, 20 boats at one time fished out of Huron. Zimmerman's had their own fish house, or their own twine house.
Do you want to describe to us what a twine house was?
Well, the standard twine house, as I remember it, and I was in many of them because that's where us kids hung around, which leads me to another story, but we'll hang that up for a minute. A twine house on the first floor has open access, usually had a dock behind it at river level where you could pull a boat right up to the side, and they would handle the fish off of the boat. Sometimes they were put in boxes from there, sometimes they were shoveled in, depending on the volumes, set up on the dock, and then taken in to the first floor. The first floor was built as low as possible, so you didn't have to lift them up too far from the dock. The first step was to be on level with the boat so you could get them out of the boat easy. The second step was to get them up in. That's where they cleaned them and did whatever they had to do. The second floor, or the loft, was where the net repair went on. Net repair was a constant because of all the junk. I can just barely remember a lot of the fish steaks out in the lake. They're still marked on some of the charts. The common method for fishing before they came up with the gill net idea, they would go out with what they call pound boats. And you would carry the pole laying down flat on the boat, and it had a bowsprit out in the front with a roller on it, so the men could stand that post up, put it down into the water, then pound the stake
okay.
into the ground. Then they would put another one a little distance away, and they would attach the nets between those. From there, they went to the gill nets. We had no trap netters here. There were a few trap net boats from east, up around Ashtabula, overwintered here because the ice always opened up earlier here than it did in Ashtabula. So they would fish the first few weeks or months of the season here, then move back home. All the twine houses were built the same. They all had the first floor, and they all had the loft in the second floor. They would use those to store the nets also. Tarring the nets was extremely important. Most didn't tar them at the twine house. They would rent ground from various farmers out around, and they would have big vats of tar. Some had the tar vats on a truck so that they could dip the nets in the tar, and then they had reels, powered reels that was up on one side, and they would go to the field and pull that out and let it dry in the field. It was a very, very hard job. Fishing was hard work. It was dangerous work.
And they tarred them for what reason?
To preserve the nets. They would rot very quickly if you didn't do that, and that was the only preservative they had.
And they had to do this every year?
They did this more than one time a year, I believe. And they had cans for floats that were stitched into the top, and weights, cast iron weights on the bottom that were sewn into the net. And you could always find those along the beach when there were a lot of people out there fishing. And it's my understanding that there was, in fact, I have a picture at home of a plant that made those tin floats in Huron, and I've never been able to find anybody that could substantiate. I know the young lady whose father participated in that business. She's about 70 now, but it was supposedly along the Huron River someplace.
Could check that out. So why don't you tell us your story about the twine houses?
About the twine house.
You said that you were in, as a kid, you all hung out in the twine houses. And
well, we did, because it was my involvement with the twine house is centered around Cy Meeker. Cy Meeker was an old-time fishing family related to Gordon. I don't know just how. Cy couldn't swim a stroke. He was scared to death to go out in his boat, but he inherited the business from his father. His wife worked at the phone office on Main Street. She was an operator back when we had operators. And Cy was one of these, he was just a crusty old fisherman. He smelled of tar all the time. He was just different. And he would beg us to go out in the boat with him, because he always knew that there was going to be a time when somebody had to go overboard to untangle something or fix this or get that. Or occasionally a fisherman would get their propeller wrapped up in the nets, and the only way to do it was dive under the boat and get that. Well, Cy was in trouble if he got to that point. So he wouldn't go out if he didn't have somebody to go with him. So, but where else was there to go? I mean, if you didn't hang around a fish house, where did you hang?
so you and your friends would go out in the boat with them?
He would pick a couple of us to go, yeah. And he'd pay us a pittance and work the dickens out of us, and that's why he had trouble getting anybody to go with him. It was amazing at the number of fish boats that there were there. They would be stacked up. They wouldn't just be one along the shore. They would be one tied to another, maybe 3 deep.
When did fishing cease to be a viable industry here?
When the government said, we'll take care of you. Usually back, the best of my memory, it started downhill in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a dying industry at that point. The real killer was, to my knowledge, now you understand, you're talking to a poor dumb farmer who doesn't, I mean, he just knows what he remembers. Canada lowered the length limit to 6 inches. The US limit is still 6.5, which means that it's much easier. Almost every perch we eat here comes from Canada right now, because they have lower restrictions. There might be 1 boat fishes out of Sandusky. I think there's 3 out of Port Clinton, and they're just not there.
It.
Yeah, and Sandusky used to have, I guess, hundreds. I mean, that was a big industry there. Fishing was was a major industry and a major employer because it was labor intensive. Let's switch to my grandfather for a few minutes. He was what they called then the yard master for the Nickel Plate Railroad in Huron. That was the second largest freight handling terminal on the Nickel Plate Road at that time. He moved here from the third largest, which was Zanesville. And he left here in '48 to go to the largest, which was Canton, outside of the Timken roller mill. I was always very proud of my grandfather. He had what I thought was an important job, or to me, as a kid, seemed like a very important. He took me to his office, which was something for, I mean, that.
What did he do as yard master?
Controlled all the labor in the incoming and outgoing freight from the Huron terminal. They also had one of the largest repair facilities here, south of Cleveland Road, was what they called the hammer track, where all the cars were repaired. The weigh station was also there.
That's the weigh station for the coal and
yes,
the iron
when
ore?
when the coal came in, they would weigh it there. When the ore went out, they would weigh it there. There was also a repair building on the north side of the tracks, up close to where Eastern States or the mill is located, where they did heavy repair on engines, tenders, what have you. And there was a large crew work there. So it was quite a bustling industry at that time. Very labor intensive. Each engine had 3 people on it. One of the thrills of my life, he would take me down with him and put me on a switch engine, and I would ride the engine down to the south yards, and he'd come down there to pick me up. Now, I was only 7 or 8 years, but I can remember that as clear as day, what a thrill that was to ride that switch engine down there. He was also the first president of the Rotary Club in Huron.
What was his name?
Calvin Norris.
Okay.
He was involved in the Rotary Club in Zanesville. And when he came here, he got with some other like-minded people, along with the Vermilion Rotary Club, and they formed a club here, and he was fortunate enough to be the first president. Dr. Lighthizer was the second president. So it had an early beginning. One of my first off-the-farm jobs in Huron was to set pins at the bowling alley. Now, this was an exciting adventure back then. There was a pit where the ball and the pins wound up. You jumped up and sat on the wall. When they threw the ball down the alley, knocked the pins down, you jumped down in there, threw the ball up into the track, picked the pins up, set them back in the rack, and jumped out of the way, hopefully before the next ball came down. Now, the only way to really make any money at that was to set what they called leagues. There were a lot of bowling leagues. Wasn't much to do here in the wintertime. And this was one of the few jobs. Well, if you set 2 leagues at the same time, which means 4 alleys, each league used 2 alleys, and you did the 7 o'clock league and the 9 o'clock league, you could make $4.50 a night. Now, that was huge money for a teenager. It was a killer, but it was huge money back then. If I remember right, it was 5 cents a line, which means it just didn't add up. Nelson Gunn was the manager at the bowling alley. I think the bowling alley was owned at that point by Carl Wechter and Chet Senders, if I remember right. They were very active business people in Huron. My father had the exalted title of street superintendent in Huron for 10 years. It was the first really good job he had after the war. That period between the war and 1950 was a really rough time for a lot of families in Huron. Now, street superintendent really was a misnomer, because what it meant was that you did all the work in town. He had 2 helpers, both were hourly, and John Bose and Bill Duffy. John Bose is from a prominent family here in town, a great guy. Bill Duffy was raised at the children's home in Ashland, came up and established himself here. But they were in charge of everything. They cleaned all the snow, mowed all the grass, and at that time they cleaned the sidewalks in Huron. Anything that had to be done. And some of the more interesting jobs that I can remember, in the wintertime when we'd get a snow, the police department would call my dad at home and say the bridge is slippery, which was usually the first part to go at. Well, he had the option of calling out an hourly employee or getting me out of bed. And he was very conservative, and my job was to stand in the back of the dump truck with a scoop shovel, and as we drove across the bridge, to throw salt out on the road.
So you were the salt truck?
I was part of it, but one half of the team. And the other thing that I can remember is the June bugs, what we call June bugs. There were times when there would be piles 5 and 6 feet under the streetlights back in the 50s. And his job obviously was to clean those up, and usually before anybody got out. But it was amazing how much they congregated. Now keep in mind, that's back when the lake was at its worst, so it really promoted the June bugs. We okay?
You want to tell me a little bit about what you ended up doing then?
No.
Once you got done with school?
Geez, there's a lot of good stuff here.
Well, you can do that too.
We've got 3 minutes, Kath.
No, we can do a little more.
Well, I started off, my family all had a farm background. My father worked in the farming industry back in the 30s, had a trucking business, lost it during the Depression, worked odd jobs since then, worked at the, he followed my grandfather. My grandfather got him a job in Zanesville off of the farm and working at the Roseville Pottery Company. And from there, when my grandfather moved to Huron, he got him a job here at the Trojan Powder Works during the Second World War. That's out where the NASA plant was. He was the dispatcher for the trucks for all the freight that had left there since he was in the freight business. My dad had a bad arm. He couldn't straighten his right arm out, only to about a 45-degree angle, something like this. So he wasn't eligible for service. So they put him in a militarily sensitive job. And he worked there entirely during the war. That period after the Second World War was very tight. There were no jobs. One of the most interesting times in Huron. When I was I'll jump to answer your question. When I was a sophomore in high school, I decided that I wanted to farm. And I started very casually, very ignorantly, having no idea what I was doing. Grew sweet corn almost exclusively. That lasted until a year after I got out of high school. And I sold all my equipment, went to college, took all ag courses down to Ohio State, came back, and we started to farm again. This time on our hands and knees. The first crop I grew was a crop of radishes with no tractor.
And where was your farm?
Well, we didn't have a farm. We rented ground. Mm-hmm. And I started off out on Route 13 or 299. Mm-hmm. Then Carl Fry over on Bogart Road, he had quit farming at the time and was an extremely good vegetable grower. I wasn't smart enough to listen to him much, but he was a very, very good vegetable grower. And I just muddled through from there.
You're fine. Keep going.
Increasing the amount of acreage we farmed. Went broke 2 or 3 times, was too dumb to know it, and just kept going. We specialized in peppers for almost 10 years because I felt like I wanted to find a crop that I could grow, that I could be a bigger piece of the market. So, and we were fairly successful at that point. In 1970, we bought out the Charlie Nichols operation on Scheid Road. Mm-hmm. Myself and Kennedy Chant as a partnership. In 1974, I bought Kenny out. 1976, I bought the farm. 1982, I lost it all and started over. We had a truck accident in 1972 where a young man was killed. It was a tragic situation. Mm-hmm. One of our drivers was at fault. And that, together with a lot of poor management. We happened to have a hailstorm in 1980 that we lost our entire cabbage crop. Yeah. And one thing, but it was mostly my ignorance. I can't blame it on anybody else. We lost the farm and everything that we had. We might have had a good shirt among us. I'm not sure that we did.
Whoa.
But it was start over time, and we managed to buy back with help a 6-acre farm on the corner of your neighbor and Scheid. And we farmed just that, went to farmers markets, gradually rented a little more ground, continued to go to farmers markets until 1984 when we started in with the chefs.
Okay, we were talking about the chef's garden. I want to know how you started selling to chefs.
Well, it happened quite casually and almost by accident. We were going to farmers markets, and my son Lee was going to the East Side Market in Cleveland, which is an old-time farmers market. One Saturday, a young lady approached him and said she wanted squash blossoms. And we came home and we had an office about twice the size of a good outhouse with a cardboard table, or card table sitting in the middle of it. And we all gathered around the table after we got back from market. Now keep in mind, we've been up for 2 days, no sleep, worked our tails off. We're sitting around here counting our money and telling about all the bad things that happened. And he said, "Dad, there was this gal here wanted to buy squash blossoms." And I said, "She's got to be crazy." Now keep in mind, my background was selling semi-loads of zucchini squash. So I knew nothing about what they were talking about. So we dropped it. Well, 3 weeks later, he came home with the same story. And I started getting red from here up because we usually didn't talk about things twice in our family. It was a one-time deal. And Lee said, "Dad, this gal is really interested." And I started to jump on him. And he said, "Now, wait a minute, Dad. She'll pay 50 cents a piece for them." And I said, "Well, just how many does she want?" And that's where it started. Her name was Iris Balin. Mm-hmm. She was executive chef with Prescott Ball and Turbin in Cleveland. And that winter, she came out with a chef from Sammy's, which was the first upscale restaurant in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. And they gathered around our kitchen table with a list of 15 items that they wanted us to grow, none of which I'd ever heard of. And they were selling hard. And the harder they sell, the further I backed up and said, I don't want any part of this. This went on for 2 hours. And finally I said, "Look it. How many farmers have you been to with this scheme?" And they both got this dumb look on their face and looked at each other, trying to decide whether to answer. 14. And I said, "We'll do it." I figured if 14 farmers said no, we ought to try it. So I spent the rest of that winter trying to find out how to grow. Now, at that time, those were unheard of, things like radicchio or arugula that nobody had ever. French beans. What in the world's a French bean? Does it speak different than we do? I don't know. But the point of it is we did grow, and the agreement was that they would take everything we grew the next year, and we grew a minimal amount, and they did take it all. And word spread from one restaurant to the other. We have never done any advertising. We've always had an unlisted phone number. We've never gone out and encouraged business. It's all been by word of mouth from one chef to the other. And before long, we were selling some in Columbus. Well, the chef from the Hyatt Regency in Columbus got a promotion to the Grand Hyatt in New York City. Well, before long, we were shipping into New York City. And it just grew organically, internally. And it's been a wonderful experience. We have some of the best chefs in the world working with us. If we have a claim to fame, it's the fact that we've listened to the chefs. Everything we grow is because a chef told us he wanted it. We experiment. We grow about 500 unusual varieties every year that we're not currently growing, or we're looking for a different variety to see whether there's anything else out there. But we walk the chefs through the field and see if there's anything they like. If they hit on something, well, then we grow it. If they don't like it, we don't grow it. Our main method of expanding the business is always to bring chefs in and have them walk through the fields, taste, touch, feel, sniff, smell, whatever. And that's continued. In 2001, we started the Culinary Vegetable Institute, which is a facility that sits on 100 acres, rather secluded, and the idea being that a chef can come in there and either rest and relax or experiment in the kitchen. We were named Experimental Kitchen of the Year by Food Arts Magazine in 2004. Last year we had 557 chefs visit the farm. They would either stay at the Culinary Vegetable Institute. We have housing there. We have an executive chef suite, which is rather nice, and we also have housing for 16 and dormitory-style housing in the basement. So if he wants to bring his team in and work on menu development, which they do quite often, we can house all of them. It's a continually growing operation and changing. We've, like everyone else, had rough times here in the last year. This economy has slowed us down. Fortunately, we were somewhat prepared for it. We started an e-commerce division 2 years ago, and that's just now getting up. And we're also heavily involved in the healthcare field. We've been testing for 4 years the antioxidant content of all of the vegetables we grow, and found that we can affect the antioxidant content by the methods we grow, using all natural methods. So we've come up with some things that really have a home in the healthcare field.
Well, Bob, I wish we had more time because this is fascinating, but I'm afraid for right now this is it, and I'd like to thank you very much for talking with us.
It's been my pleasure. I hope it's of some service.
Mm-hmm.